Let's move now to the United Kingdom, where former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been asked to allow the British government access to his WhatsApp messages. The request is in connection with the government's probe into how the COVID-19 pandemic was handled. Now, authorities are after texts sent in a WhatsApp group filled with senior government leaders believed to be used as a key decision-making platform. Let's get the latest on the story and more from London with our correspondent, Ollie Barrett. So, Ollie, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. So we all know about Partygate. I kind of thought the investigations into COVID and politicians was done and dusted. Clearly not. What's this all about?
Just getting going, actually, Sally. This is the public inquiry into COVID-19 and how it was dealt with in the UK. It's going to be incredibly wide-ranging. It'll last for many months, if not years, by the end of it. And there are various stages to it. And what we've got to now is the procedural start of one of the phases which is going to be looking at policy making, political decision making when it comes to COVID-19. And where we've got to so far is that the lawyers in the inquiry are really setting out what kind of detail they want to look at and the kind of evidence that they want to look at to help them get to some of their conclusions, or at least present the evidence that will become the conclusions of the inquiry in the end. And what we've been hearing today from the lawyers for the inquiry is that they want to get their hands on WhatsApp messages between Boris Johnson and some of his key staff in the weeks and months leading up to the peak of the COVID-19 outbreak in this country and afterwards as well. That is going to form an investigation into things like whether the UK should have locked down earlier for COVID-19, whether that could have saved significant amounts of lives. And they'll try and therefore look at the conversations that Boris Johnson was having at the time with some of his key lieutenants to work out whether people were telling him that lockdown was needed and was needed more rapidly, and whether indeed he was pushing back at that particular idea. But they will also look at whether politicians were being given the right advice, or good advice, or advice that you now look back on and think was wise with hindsight. It's incredibly complicated, the process of this inquiry, but that's where we've reached so far, is that the lawyers for the inquiry are setting out exactly what type of evidence they want to see in the various phases. And in this particular phase, when it comes to political decision-making and policy, is going to try and look at some of those government comms inside some of the key communications channels leading up to the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic and, of course, all the deaths that came from it.
And Rishi Sunak, who's the Prime Minister now, was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister during COVID. Is there a possibility that he might get drawn into this, and other members of the current cabinet?
Absolutely, and it's very much expected that through the various different phases of this inquiry, there are going to be serving and former cabinet ministers and prime ministers as well who will be asked to give oral evidence, and that we will get to see much of that in public as well. So this is a potentially very difficult moment for quite a lot of senior British politicians. At the same time, it offers some of them the opportunity to tell their side of the story and to set out some of the reasons that they made the decisions that they did at the time. One of the key refrains from allies of Boris Johnson has been that he got the big decisions right at the right time, and they'll point to things like the vaccine rollout as areas that they will say that he succeeded in while he was the Prime Minister overseeing the pandemic response. But clearly critics of Boris Johnson have been very loudly saying that they believe he failed for a number of reasons. So potentially tricky moments ahead for politicians, current and former, here in the UK when it comes to cabinet members, but prime ministers too.
What's going on with Suella Braverman? I see that she's in more hot water because of those 6 emails that apparently she sent, work emails, to her private address. I mean, could she get the chop for this?
It's possible that she could get the chop for the second time in just as many weeks, really. Just back in the job for days after being reappointed by Rishi Sunak as the Home Secretary, days after she initially resigned for a security breach, which did involve her sending on government documents from her personal email in a way that she shouldn't have done. She resigned at the time, accepted she'd made a mistake, but when she was brought back by Rishi Sunak, that led to all sorts of questions about whether he was making the right move. Today we've heard from her that actually it was, as you say, several other occasions on which she did similar. She shared government documents via a personal email account, and that was clearly in breach of the way that she should have been operating as well. So further questions about whether she should be in post in the first place, whether she should remain in post too. She's also dealing with a migrant crisis on the south of England at the moment, which is leading to severe criticism for the government. So she's very much a Home Secretary in hot water, and that's why, as you say, there is speculation that she could either be forced out of her job or be forced to resign from her post for the second time in a very short period of time.
Yeah, I would imagine security concerns are heightened with the news that Liz Truss, when she was PM, possibly her private cell phone was compromised. I want to finally ask you about the COP27 climate change conference, which is happening in Egypt in November. Last year, of course, COP26 in Glasgow. Boris Johnson was all over that. Rishi Sunak saying, well, actually, I'm not going, I'm too busy, we've got too much to sort out at home. Boris Johnson now saying, well, I'm going this year. I mean, is Rishi Sunak going to go or not?
Yeah, it looks like he might turn up now, actually. It could be a U-turn from the government if he does, though, because it was being very clearly told to journalists here in London by Downing Street last week that Rishi Sunak wouldn't be going, and he'd be focusing instead on the domestic economic agenda, and he'd be sending officials from the UK government rather than going himself. But that intervention from Boris Johnson to suggest that he would probably be attending might have played into the fact that Rishi Sunak and Downing Street are now suggesting that if he can fit time into his schedule, he will go. When Downing Street said he wasn't going, that led to huge criticism from environmentalists and climate activists who said it showed he was deprioritising climate change and action on climate change. The government denied that was the case at all. But bear in mind that this is the UK handing over its COP presidency to Egypt at this summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, and so many people here in the UK are saying that Rishi Sunak should go, and it looks like he might do.
Thank you very much, Ollie Barrett, our correspondent in London.